the idea is that once you've got an absolute source of meaning in your life, an unconditional commitment, then that has authority for you. And you feel you've got to do whatever that relation requires. That should be obvious, but I try to bring in examples as best I can. The best example I know is the Shakespeare play Much Ado About Nothing. How many of you know that play? Good. Well, it doesn't worry about this issue the way Kierkegaard does, that Benedict loves Beatrice, not Dante's Beatrice, but another Beatrice, and she demands that he kill Claudio. So he's upset about it because he doesn't want to be a murderer. But if the most important person in his life, what gives his life meaning and gives him his identity, requires it, then he better do it. So the ethical side, namely, you shouldn't go around killing people, is in conflict with the unconditional commitment side. Now, that's clear. In Kierkegaard's life, there's also something related, something murky that I don't want to sink into the gossip of. But he's done two things at once when he broke with Regina. He saw that the defining commitment was, for some reason we're not very clear about, impossible. And he went against the ethical because he broke his engagement. In 1850 Copenhagen, that's a big deal. So the first thing he deals with in what we've been reading in the preliminary, the something from the heart, preamble from the heart, is the part about, now I don't have any girlfriend anymore. I just lost my defining commitment person. And the next thing, problems 1 and 2, are about, but how could anybody ever go against the ethical and do something wrong and somehow feel at the same time that was just exactly the right thing to do, which is how he feels about it. And the third problem, which we don't read at all, is about keeping secrets and whether he was sort of manipulating his relation with Regina and what kind of secrets is okay to keep and what not. And we're not going to read that. You can read it on your own. So here we go. Well, let me see now where I am. Okay, the crucial move now is that Isaac goes from being representing the object of a defining commitment in the preamble from the heart, totally switches around and represents the ethical. But that's why I told you about Regina. When he breaks with Regina, he does two separate things. Regina stands for the defining commitment, but breaking with her, breaking his engagement, is breaking the ethical. So it's natural that what he's going to talk about are two different phenomena, but they're all tied up together. But it means that Isaac is looked at under two different descriptions. Isaac is, we've seen already, the object of Abraham's defining commitment. On 54 is where this gets talked about. I haven't mentioned it, but I did mention it in passing, but I never read it. Maybe that's because, is it within your reading? No, that's why I haven't ever read it, but I'll read it because that's the nearest to a statement that Isaac represents for Abraham his defining commitment, namely what his identity is, and that it says, about 15 lines down, Abraham believed he would become old in his land, honored among his people, blessed in his kin, eternally remembered in Isaac, the dearest in his life. I take that to mean Abraham thinks of himself as the father of the faith by way of Isaac, and therefore Isaac is somehow tied up in his understanding of who he is. I don't think that's very important. It's just important to realize that Isaac has switched around by page 88. When you get to problem 1, it's totally switched. I don't know how anybody ever understands this book, because so many weird things are happening. It took me years to unscramble it, and lots of help from students, and I'm still ready to be helped any time. It's never completely unscrambled. On page 88, we read, at the end of middle paragraph. Insofar as the universal was there, we'll get back to the universal, that's the ethical. The ethical gives you universal principles. Well, that needs some explaining, but for the moment. Insofar as the universal was there at all, it was latent in Isaac, concealed as it were in his loins. All that means is, and it would cry out with Isaac's mouth, don't do it. You're destroying everything. Meaning, well, don't do it because you're going against the ethical is what it means now. And so now we have to understand what the ethical is, and we have to understand a new paradox and a new anguish. Everything gets another meaning. Not that it contradicts the old meaning, it's just a whole different perspective on the Abraham, Isaac, or the Kierkegaard, Regina story. Okay, so now we're going to go back to 83. It needs lots of explaining. He jumps right in, assuming that you have been reading Kant and Hegel, I think, and like the people in Denmark in those days. And I need to explain it to you enough so that you can understand without having to read any Kant and Hegel, which is a big help. So okay, here we go. I'm going to just start reading it and explaining it because it throws a huge amount at you right off. The ethical as such is the universal. And as the universal, it applies to everyone, which can be put from another point of view by saying it applies at every moment. That means if there's something that's right, then it's right for everybody all the time, if it's really the right thing to do. Or, more likely, it's going to be a wrong thing to do, like don't lie. And if that turns out to be the right advice, then it means nobody, anywhere, anytime ought to lie. And that's a universal principle. And Kant thought there were such universal principles, and he thought that they were ethical universal principles. They had authority because they were rational. I won't bother to explain that. But they had authority over all human beings because human beings are rational. So let's go on. And it rests immanently in itself with nothing outside itself that is its telos, but is itself the telos for everything outside. And when that is taken up into it, it has no further to go. That means it's the highest thing. If I tell you a principle, let's make it positive, always tell the truth. That's there's no higher reason to do that. I didn't say tell the truth because if you don't, people will find out and won't like you. Or always tell the truth because it's good for business in the long run. Or if you do, you'll feel better about yourself. Those would all be reasons for telling the truth. But there isn't any reason for telling the truth except that that's the right thing to do. And that's the sense in which telos, meaning end, or final reason, the final reason is just the ethical principle itself. Kant talks about it being a categorical imperative. You don't have to worry about those big terms. And he says it's not a hypothetical imperative. That's helpful in that jargon. You only, again, don't worry about it. Don't need to write it down. But the hypothetical imperative says this thing I've been saying. If you want to be liked, always tell the truth. Or if you want to be believed, always tell the truth. That is, if something, then the ethical. But the ethical isn't a hypothetical. If you want to be something, do something. It just says do it. That's a categorical imperative. That's where we are so far. Seen as immediate, let's see where we are. No more than sensate and psychic being, the single individual is the particular that has its telos in the universal, and the individual's ethical task is always to express himself in this, to abrogate his particularity so as to become the universal. Well, that's a mouthful, but it's not so hard to understand. That is, remember way back when I said what the Greeks thought about ethics, and it was that the ethical principles applied to everybody all the time, and now we're adding a new thing. Insofar as you do the right thing, you do what anybody would do. You subsume yourself into the universal. That is, the highest thing for you to do is what everybody would do, and you want to not be a particular. That's lower immediacy. You want to become the universal. That is, you want to do the ethical thing which anybody at any time in that situation would do. That's being ethical. If you don't do that, then you just do your own thing, and you could state another way to state the ethical principles are, don't make an exception of yourself. You can't say, well, this is a pretty tough situation, and for most people, most of the time they shouldn't lie, but boy, this would help a lot if I lied right now. And that's not ethical. Or a lot of you have read Crime and Punishment, right? How many read Crime and Punishment? Raskolnikov thinks that, he doesn't have to worry about the ethical. He's a superior being. And as a superior human being, he just makes an exception of himself. And he does what he wants to do. He needs money, so he wants to kill the pawnbroker. Well, that's exactly unethical. That's sinning. You've got, how many bring along this paper that I gave out? Probably not very many. So how many? Lots. Good. Well, look at it, and I'll draw a sketch of it on the board, but it's better if you look at it. We're now in the middle picture. And the ethical I'm going to write here is the universal. And if you're here doing something, there are two ways to deviate from the universal. I'm talking about only one of them right now. And you do your own thing. You act like an individual, like a particular, and that is temptation. That is, he calls it also sin. That's the picture you have of doing something wrong. And if you do that, then you're guilty and you have to do something to repent. And if you're guilty, you repent, you pay your price to society or whatever, and then so that you can get back to the universal. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So let me see if I read the first basic things I need to read. Yeah. And now I have to say something about the translation, which is very confusing. In fact, every year I'm confused about it differently. I think last time I taught it, I still had it wrong. What's puzzling is that there's only one Danish word which means both individual and means particular. Remember, I said, when I talked about Kierkegaard, he said he wanted to be an individual, and I said for that you need an unconditional commitment. But anybody's a particular. That just means one among many. So you could put on your dog's tombstone, here lies a particular, but you couldn't put on your dog's tombstone, here lies an individual. I use that weird example because Kierkegaard said, I don't think I said this, maybe I did, that he wanted carved on his tombstone, here lies an individual. Well, individual here is being used not in that fancy, special Kierkegaardian sense, but really as synonymous with the particular. See, the trouble is, with one Danish word, you could hear it either way, and presumably in Denmark you could hear in context when Kierkegaard said he wanted it on his tombstone, here lies an individual, he didn't mean by that word just any old particular. But the translator tries to fix it by saying single individual, and that's supposed to mean the same as particular. And I would just put instead, whenever you see single individual, put person. Something just to help you remember that this is not the fancy individual that Kierkegaard wants to talk about. You could put particular, only obviously that's going to get you in trouble later for reasons I can't explain. Not deep reasons, just translation reasons. But so, and the reason this is mixed up, this is what I understood this time for the first time in all these years. I thought, why in the world doesn't he find another word? Why does he say a word in Danish which has to be translated somehow, and then it gets translated singular individual? Isn't that confusing? Well, it's not confusing if you remember, which I didn't, that this is being written from the point of view of the ethical, this paragraph. And from the point of view of the ethical, there is only one opposite to the universal. I mean, if it isn't universal, it's particular, or, in our translation, single individual. And that's because, that's very important that's very important because he's going to go on and on about the fact that if you believe that the only alternatives that philosophy believes, Hegel believes, Kant believes, the only alternative to doing what is universal and what everybody does is doing your own thing. And doing your own thing it doesn't make a distinction from the point of view of the ethical, whether you're doing your own thing by loving the princess or whether you're doing your own thing by killing the princess. You're just doing your own thing and you're making an exception of yourself. So the idea that there could be a higher immediacy up there, a super kind of exception, and Kierkegaard sometimes calls the higher immediacy person the exception. The ethical doesn't have that, and that's the point. That philosophy doesn't have any notion of a difference between a particular and a super individual. They're just all particulars, and that's why this is hard to read. But just don't associate it to anything special about the individual, and it'll be all right. So I guess I'll go on reading it that way. But I mean, I don't know whether I don't know whether it's better to say person or single individual. I thought once it was misleading to say single individual, but now I see that if you read this as speaking from the ethical, then it's not misleading. It's the ethical that's misled, so to speak. The ethical can't make a distinction. So anyway, but that is all something maybe that I shouldn't even tell you, except that you'll see in later passages, which we may or may not get to today, the individual gets all confused because it isn't written from the point of view of the ethical. Never mind, for the moment. You can understand it now if you just don't worry about that. Notice that it gets to be the particular later in the same paragraph. I read it. The universal, wait, where is it? See how the single individual is the particular. You see, he's not making a distinction that has its telos in the universal. And the individuals, that's still a single individual, that's still just you or me. Ethical task is always to express himself in this, to abrogate his particularity so as to become universal. That's the clearest way to put it. Then that's what that whole paragraph is trying to say. You've got to stop being here, making an exception of yourself, and do what any right-thinking person will do. Is that okay? I mean, I'm sorry to throw you into this because I don't know if it's worth it. If I were translating it, I guess I would just say all the time particular and not mess people up. But this is how this guy decided to do it. Now let's see. Now the question is, what's so important about the ethical from the Kierkegaardian and, I think, Hegelian point of view? I think maybe for Plato, the ethical is important for reasons that if you don't do the ethical, you won't be fulfilled and happy. But that, from a Kantian point of view, you should be used to it. Now, what would that be? If you want to be happy, do the ethics. What would that be? That would be having a hypothetical imperative. If you want to be happy, do the ethical. Kant doesn't like Plato and Aristotle. He thinks that there's no reason to do the ethical except that it's the ethical. It's the right thing to do. Any reasonable being will do it. But is there any, if it isn't in Plato, where will you find the advantage of being ethical? Well, Hegel has a story about it, which is very interesting and crucial to this whole discussion. And that's on 103. And I'll just say it in my language and then I'll read it. The ethical is what makes you intelligible to yourself and everybody else. Meaning, you can explain and justify what you're doing. You can say, I'm telling the truth to this person, even though it's going to hurt them a lot, because it wouldn't be right to lie to them. Or you can say, I don't know, I'm giving back all this money I just found on the street because it isn't mine and it belongs to somebody else, and you've got to respect people's property. You can explain what you're doing. You can also explain when you're doing something wrong and you know it's wrong, and you can say, I'm doing this because I just can't help it, but I know I shouldn't, and so forth. But you can, to yourself and to everybody else, make sense of what you're doing by way of the ethical. I'll explain it more in a minute, but first I'll just read it, the middle of 103. Faith Knight knows that it is glorious to belong to the universal. Never mind who knows it. It's glorious to belong to the universal. He knows it is beautiful and benign to be the particular, this is okay, who translates himself into the universal. The one who, so to speak, makes a clear and elegant edition of himself, as immaculate as possible and readable for all. That's this intelligence. He knows it is refreshing to become intelligible to oneself in the universal, so that he understands the universal, and everyone who understands him understands the universal through him in turn, and both rejoice in the security of the universal. That's all a poetic-ish way to say that it's a good thing there's a shared public moral vocabulary that tells us what's good and bad and right and wrong. And in a nice way of putting it that another philosopher has, what's worthy and not worthy. That we have a whole way of talking about that. And now it's important too to see that once you put it that way, you don't have to believe in the universal like in Kant, namely that there is some right way to behave, and that everybody everywhere, insofar as they're a rational being like us, recognizes it. We don't believe that anymore. We know there are all these different cultures who have very different understandings of what's good and what's bad. Some think property is very important. Some think property doesn't matter at all, and so forth. And Hegel already knew that. And one of his changes over time was to say what's important is that you have a shared vocabulary about what's worthy and unworthy, shared with your peers. It doesn't have to be universal. You can, even if you're a macho motorcycle biker, then you have your vocabulary of who's tough and who's not, who's strong and who's feminine and a sissy and weak, who and so forth. And you can explain what you're doing to the other people in the group. If you're sort of beating up on somebody, they'll all understand that that's a good thing to do. And if you are not beating up on somebody when you could, you'll have to make excuses and so forth. You just want to get a feeling that you will be intelligible to yourself and them as long as you use their vocabulary of who's tough and who's weak. And that's what you gain in the ethical. It isn't necessary to put it in other jargon. It isn't necessary to have an answer to what's right and what's wrong, as long as you understand in your group what's good and what's bad. That's just the way the philosophers use these words. There's nothing really magical about it. But the good and bad changes from culture to culture and group to group. And that's enough to give you the value of the ethical, making you intelligible. You don't have to believe in right and wrong, that there's one answer to the which of all the many goods in many cultures is the right one. Okay, now, it's the way Kierkegaard sets this up. I told you all that because problem one discusses it as if you were believing Kant, and as if there was one universal which applied to everybody everywhere. But problem two discusses it in a different language and talks about the question of whether you're in lower immediacy or higher immediacy. That is, whether you're doing something that is intelligible to other people or whether you're just making an exception of yourself. We'll get to those. But the main thing is now to see where we are. In Hegel jargon, I think that problem one is about the universal, and problem two is about the concrete universe. which is how there is something universal in your particular culture and your particular vocabulary, and it's only universal relative to your culture and your vocabulary. It's the universal made concrete, made specific, as it's specific in your world. Any problems about this? I mean, we just thought we'd get all these philosophical things in place before we can get back to particular Kierkegaardian puzzles. Okay, so now then, and I have written down here, every culture has its distinctions of worthiness and how different they are. I mean, I jumped into these bikers, but to say something more relevant to the course, the Greeks that we talked about will have their values, their moral vocabulary, and they will distinguish between heroes and slaves. And that's a very different distinction. I think I may have mentioned this before than what the medieval Christians will have, which is a distinction between saints and sinners. They're very. Did I talk about this at all? I don't think so. Okay, well, it's worth noticing that the different stages in our culture have had different senses of the ethical and the universal and different moral vocabularies. If you try to think of the medievals in terms of hero and slave, you get very messed up, because a saint is more like a slave, at least from the Greek point of view. A saint lets everybody walk all over them. So if that saint hits them, if somebody hits the saint on the cheek, they don't slap back. They let them hit them on the other. They are non-violent and so forth. That's a very pathetic way to be from Homeric point of view. And if you try to bring heroes in to the medievals, they turn out to be sinners, because they don't have any humility or any sense that there's a higher authority, namely God. They think they're the highest authority and they can protect themselves and everybody else, and everybody should look up to them and sing songs about them, as in Homer. And they turn out to be in hell in Dante. The few heroes we see, they don't get to paradise. And then it gets interesting, and I'll give you just two more because they turn out to be relevant. When you get to the modern, obviously, after Kant, maybe it isn't obvious, but you'll hear it. It feels sort of obvious to us, though I think we might not be in it anymore. At the time, from Kant up to recently, the big distinctions between the, so to speak, good and bad was between being mature and immature. For Kant, the great thing about rational human beings is they were mature in the sense that they took responsibility for what they did. They understood that it was rational. They could justify it. They could justify their actions. And as he puts it, it was immature. It was childish to believe that it was the Pope or the Prince that told you what to do. Nobody tells you what to do but your own rationality. You have to be autonomous. That's maturity. And that's what, according to Kant, was discovered in the Enlightenment. And that's all neat. But I'm not sure we have that distinction so important for us anymore. For what we're going to discuss later, I think one of our important distinctions is whether you're healthy or sick, whether you're natural or perverted. Something else, something like that might be our distinction. And then other cultures would even have other ones. Okay, so we got these moral distinctions relative to the group and making you intelligible to your peer group. All you have to do to be intelligible is do what's good according to your community. So on 97, well, I read it, I gestured at it, but I better read the beginning of that paragraph. In the ethical view of life, now we're into the Hegel, where it's not absolute anymore. In the ethical view of life, then, it is the individuals, I would say particulars, but if you remember, this is not going to be the fancy kind of individual. I'd still write in particular if I were you. It's the same Danish word. It's easier. In the ethical view of life, then, it's the particular's task to divest himself of the determinants of interiority. That's the inner, the private stuff. And give it an expression in the exterior. That's the making it intelligible. Whenever the particular shrinks from doing so. Whenever he wants to stay inside or slip back into the inner determinants of feeling, mood, etc., he commits an offense. He is in a state of temptation. So to be in a state of temptation, you are going in some way to not be intelligible, to make an exception of yourself, to do what you feel like doing in your mood with your desires and whatever. And that, I think that's all we need. Yes, don't read further. That will blow your mind too soon. Okay, so Kierkegaard wants to keep, remember now, Kierkegaard wants to keep the achievements of Greek philosophy in such a way as to have the best of both worlds. That's what makes him interesting. But he's running into something that looks like a big problem. And namely, there's something in the Judeo-Christian tradition, starting with Abraham, which the Greek tradition has no understanding of. Namely, that people can have defining commitments that make them an individual. Let's write it with a capital I. That kind of individual Kierkegaard wants to be and wants everybody to be. And then that has, we're back to this thing I started with, a higher authority in your life than the ethical. And that's in a way says you are making an exception of yourself. You are an exception, and that's just the opposite of ethical. That's the sense in which, for the Judeo-Christians, the individual is higher than the universal. Remember, I put that slogan on the board the first lecture. Now you see what it means. Once you've got a defining commitment, it trumps the ethical. It tells you that what you're supposed to do, and it may not be at all what everybody's supposed to do. Just to keep you reminding of what's in the background, Abraham's going to kill Isaac. That's what Abraham has to do for some obscure reason that we don't, and Kierkegaard never explains. And Kierkegaard has to break his engagement with Regina for some obscure reason. But these obscure reasons are their calling, are their vocation, are the most individual thing about them. And that means they have to go against the ethical, which says don't kill anybody. That's not the good way to do it. Don't break your engagements and so forth. So what the Judeo-Christian thinks is highest is already sin for the Greeks. And now the question is, how is Kierkegaard going to get these two together? I mean, these big conflicted worlds. Well, in a certain way, you can't get them together, but you can put them in some kind of relationship that will save the ethical, even from being totally irrelevant. I'll explain it right now. Well, no, first I better just read you another at the bottom of 97. Again, now, boy, this is mixed up. I thought I had figured it out, but the translation is hopeless. My idea, oh nuts, my idea that single individual was a way of talking about the particular from the point of view of the ethical doesn't work, because at the bottom of 97, he's talking from the point of view of faith. He says this is faith's paradox. Faith's paradox is this, that the single individual is higher than the universal. You got to cross out single there. That is, the capital I individual is higher than the universal. It is a mess. This moral is the translator doesn't understand it, and there's only one Danish word, and somehow Kierkegaard thought it was obvious, and I don't know whether every reader in Denmark thought it was obvious or not. So anyway, we're going to read it now. Then faith's paradox is this, that the individual, capital I, is higher than the universal. That the individual, never mind the parentheses, that the individual determines his relation to the universal through his relation to the absolute. That always means his or her vocation, what is unconditional in their life. Not his relation to the absolute through his relation to the universal. That would be Plato. That the good is the absolute. The more universal you are, the closer you are to doing what every human being ought to do, and to make them happy. That would be getting in the right relation to the universal. The paradox can also be put by saying that there is an absolute duty to God. Always right. Whenever you see God, it's very confusing because we never are told who God is or what God is or anything else, because Kierkegaard isn't really thinking of God in the normal way. Whenever you see God, you should write in something like your calling, your vocation. I mean, there's a calling, but it isn't really from anybody. It isn't as if God is actually calling. What's important is that there is something that has authority in your life that is absolute for you. That's the princess, or that's your that, like Martin Luther King, your commitment to something. So there is something then, and you have an absolute duty to do what that calling is. For in this tie or obligation, the individual with a capital I relates himself absolutely as the single individual. No, as the individual with a capital I. I just keep rewriting it. To the absolute. That is, to whatever is calling him to do whatever he has to do. When people now say that his duty, no, never mind that. Mm-hmm. No, it won't help to read anymore for the moment. So we just read that. Well, I'll skip just a tiny bit. If this duty, that is to do your individual thing, is absolute, your calling, the ethical is going to be reduced to the relative. That's right. Because what does that mean? That means in general it's a good thing to obey the ethical. But if there's a conflict between the ethical and your commitment has higher authority. We're back to Benedict and Beatrice, and Beatrice telling Benedict, kill Claudio. Beatrice trumps the ethical, and that makes it relative, and she has absolute authority. Okay. But now it gets really complicated, but not hopelessly so. And I mean, really clear if you just get it. For philosophy and Hegel, if faith, which is always like night of faith, requires a defining, unconditional commitment, then and requires going against the authority of the universal, what can philosophers say about faith? Well, from a philosophy point of view, faith has got to be making an exception of yourself, so that they can't tell the difference, these philosophers, between faith and sinning. I mean, faith is, if you're Judeo-Christian, faith can be going up here to your commitment, your calling. But if you don't have any up here, this is higher immediacy. If the only immediacy you know is down here, as philosophers, then you can't tell faith from sinning. That's his big thing, that he's going to, sort of destroy the usual understanding of everything by the Abraham story. He's going to sort of overthrow Hegel, who thinks he's somehow got the truth of Christianity in his philosophy, and say, no, Hegel is just a philosopher. No philosopher has the categories, the distinctions, to make sense of faith, because faith goes against the ethical, and whether you mean by the ethical the right, the universal, or whether you mean the ethical being the good in your culture, faith goes against both of them, because faith can require Abraham to murder Isaac and Benedict to murder Claudio, and Kierkegaard to break his engagement with Rudina. And this is what he now is going to talk about. On 97, he's talking about it. And if I'm going to go on reading now. The paradox of faith, I'm about 6 lines into the paragraph on 97, is this. that there is an interiority, that's again like the lower immediacy, that's your moods and stuff, that is incommensurable with the exterior, that is, can't be put in, exterior means putting it out in words so that everybody can understand it. And this interiority, if it sometimes means my moods, my obsessions, my fantasies, and so forth, which I can't put out so you can understand them. But it also could mean my unconditional commitment, which I also can't put out into words so that you can understand it. So there's an interiority incommensurable with the exterior, an interiority which it should be stressed, is not identical with the first. That's lower immediacy. But is a new interiority. That's higher immediacy. Now, then just skip a little. Recent philosophy, that's Hegel, has allowed itself without further ado to substitute the immediate for faith. That's exactly what Hegel's done. And he talks about faith as the immediate. If one does that, it is ridiculous to deny that faith has existed through all ages. Faith is such a case. Now, why would faith have existed through all ages if you identify faith with the immediate? Because the immediate has existed through all ages. Everybody's got children, and children are all selfish and inarticulate, and have all kinds of moods and fantasies and desires. I mean, the lower immediacy is the most common thing in the world. And if you go around and say, the only place we've got to put faith is down here, well, here's lower immediacy. Now this is where Hegel puts faith. Now, if you put faith there, then, to use Kierkegaard jargon, faith has never existed because it has always existed. I could find the page number for that, but I will come across it later anyway. What does it mean, faith has never existed because it's always existed? Well, if faith is the immediate, it's always existed. But if faith is the immediate, then faith has never been anything special. So there's never been anything special called faith, because there's always been plenty of people making exceptions of themselves and so forth. If I read this, maybe it'll help. You're looking dazed. This must not be overlooked. Recent philosophy puts faith with the immediate. If one does that, it's ridiculous to deny that faith has existed through all ages. Faith in such a case keeps fairly ordinary company. It belongs with, and here's the neatest list of things in the immediate he doesn't tell you very often. It belongs with feeling, mood, idiosyncrasy, hysteria, and the rest. And now what does he think about that list of things? Well, he thinks we could be a good idea to get rid of all that. So he says, so far philosophy is right to say that one should not stop at that. That is, you shouldn't sort of wallow in your feelings, moods, and hysteria. And I always put in fantasies, obsessions, what else? Superstitions, and so forth. You shouldn't stop there. But there is nothing to warrant philosophy speaking in this manner. Prior to faith, there is a movement. Oh, no, I stop with that. Because that's what I want to get at. Remember I said way back, maybe 15 minutes ago or something, that Kierkegaard wants to save some truth for philosophy, while at the same time relativizing it and saying that it hasn't got the whole story. It hasn't even got the best story. But it's a good thing to have mediation, to get over all this stuff in lower immediacy. And you couldn't even get to higher immediacy, where you have an unconditional commitment, if you didn't get rid of your fantasies and fanaticisms and so forth, because you couldn't tell the difference. But so only after you've done reflective, critical, talking to your friends and therapists or whatever, do you manage to get outside of the lower immediacy and this very personal, private craziness into this public intelligibility, which is a terrifically important thing to do. Only then are you in the position, when you get up here, to get up there in a way that distinguishes it from falling back into this. That's I'm going to talk about that for a while now. Where are we? But there's no way. I mean, here we help, here he saved a role for philosophy, right? But on the other hand, philosophy can't understand becoming an individual in that higher immediacy way. And that's the most important thing in the world to understand. That's faith. That's being the exception. So he does two jobs at once. He sort of saves philosophy, but at the same time, because we're such a conflicted culture, which would again back to the first lecture, he sort of throws the Greek thinking that philosophy is the highest thing, mediation is the highest thing, against the Judeo-Christian, which thinks that there's a higher immediacy. And that leads to this kind of conflict of cultures in which, when Abraham is killing Isaac, he both thinks that this is the best thing he ever did, and he thinks it's the worst thing he ever did if he did it, or when Kierkegaard's breaking the engagement, or Benedict, and so on, etc. And whenever you get this conflict of the two cultures, you get anguish, because there's no way to make sense of this. This is paradoxical. Here you are supposed to go against the ethical as the highest thing, but then that's the Judeo-Christian commitment story. But then the ethical is supposed to be the highest thing. That's the final telos. That's the Greek Kant Hegel story. How are you supposed to relate to the ethical? And if you go against the ethical, you're in a terrible mess because you're completely unintelligible to yourself and everybody else. That's jumping ahead, the story. But I want to just read on 60, just to show you where he sort of hits you with this. The 15 lines down. The ethical expression for what Abraham did is that he was willing to murder Isaac. The religious expression is that he was willing to sacrifice Isaac. But in this contradiction lies the very anguish that can indeed make one sleepless. And yet without that anguish, Abraham is not the one he is. The anguish is always the kind of contradiction that's lurking in the background. Remember last time anguish was only he who draws the knife will get Isaac. That is, only one who is ready to lose the defining commitment can keep the defining commitment. That's one kind of anguish. But now's a new kind of anguish. Only he who can go against the ethical can, really achieve the highest thing for you. So put it this way. So the highest thing in the Greeks was the telos. The telos was the goal. The highest goal was to be ethical. That is to get all this stuff up here to here. Now we're told, but the Judeo-Christians say there's a higher goal, to have your own calling and be an individual. Guess what we could call that? We could call that the teleological suspension of the ethical. That's what the name of this chapter is. That means the highest thing requires you to go against the ethical. Whereas for the Greeks, let me say it again, the ethical is the telos. It is the highest thing. It's the goal of human beings to become intelligible and do the universal. On the Judeo-Christian story, there's a higher goal. And in the name of that higher goal, namely your unconditional commitment, you have to go against the ethical. That means the teleological suspension of the ethical. Now, I've been talking for a long time. I'm sure somebody must have something to say about all this. Yes? The teleological suspension of the ethical is what the religious person, what faith is, what in this talk, what Abraham had, what anybody who has the highest form of Judeo-Christian life, which Kierkegaard is calling faith, has to be. Now I got to make a very important distinction. I'm glad you asked that. I wanted to say has to suspend the ethical, but that isn't quite true. You might be lucky enough that you marry your unconditional commitment boyfriend or girlfriend and live happily ever after. But if you have any imagination, you'll still be in anguish, because you'll understand that your unconditional commitment could at any moment require you to go against the ethical, that you have a higher authority in your life than the ethical. It's just accidental if you could stick with the ethical. It's like the Knight of Faith. He may live, the girl he loves, the princess, may live all the rest of her life with him. But if he's got any imagination, he sees that it's vulnerable and that the sword is hanging over the head of the beloved. So now, if he's got any imagination, he sees that there's a higher authority than the ethical in his life, and at any moment he may be called to do something that he finds absolutely abhorrent, namely like murder his son or break his engagement. Yeah.
But this comes from Kierkegaard is that the conflict between the defined community or the Christianity and the ethical or the Greek idea, the greatness doesn't necessarily come from just the faith, but it comes from the conflict.
What does? Abraham's greatness. Yes, good. And why is that? If Abraham could just dismiss the ethical, and he wouldn't have any anguish. And that's helpful, because remember I said that I haven't really made it clear enough yet. Kierkegaard is, I'll say it this way, Kierkegaard is the first and last of the existentialists who takes the philosophical Greek side seriously. And that's what and understands the ethical as something you really need, and that has authority in your life too, besides your commitment. Namely, you need to be intelligible. You need to be able to explain to yourself and everybody else what you're up to. Otherwise, you think you're crazy, and they think you're crazy. So there you are. It turns out that the greatness of what he builds into Abraham, don't mind the sort of historical anachronism that Abraham didn't know any Greek. That never mind. The real Abraham is Kierkegaard. And the Christian has this higher thing and sees the necessity of and totally respects the ethical. Now, I want to just do a quick run-through. I was going to do it later, but I'll go to it now if I can find it, where I talk about this more. Have I skipped it? No. I can make it up again, but I'd rather find out where I am. Gee, that's funny. Well, I'll just tell you, but not until I look a little longer, because it makes me nervous to think that I don't know where I am. But it's not the first time I didn't know where I was, so that's all right. I got it. I skipped it a long time ago. I've been feeling that I should have said it sometime when I put the chart on the board. So let me say it right now. It just helps to see that all the other existentialists, you'll see it when you get to Nietzsche, that he thinks the ethical is a good thing as a means to strengthening your will and your character. But you have to outgrow it, leave it behind. The true highest person for Nietzsche doesn't let themselves be bothered by the ethical, like Raskolnikov, who's very Nietzschean in Crime and Punishment. And Heidegger thinks that the ethical is just the voice of conformism. And that's if you're going to be in Heidegger jargon authentic, you don't pay attention to the ethical. You do your own unique individual thing. And Sartre in The Flies. How many read The Flies? If I were teaching existentialism in high school or something, I would read The Flies. But anyway, in The Flies, Zeus talks to Orestes about how, thanks to the ethical, Zeus manages to keep men from knowing their freedom because they think they have to obey all these universal laws. Those are all ways, and Dostoevsky too, you'll see. Ask yourself what Dostoevsky thinks of philosophy, and you'll discover in a word, philosophers are sick, according to Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. The idea that philosophers were onto something important in Greece, Kierkegaard is the only one who's got it. After that, it drops out. I think that's one of the big merits of Kierkegaard, to see that there's lots of truth in philosophy. There's just something higher, too. Remember, I read on 97, that's where I was going to talk about this, where it talks about philosophy is right to say that you should get rid of the lower immediacy, feelings, moods, whims, phobias, and all that sort of thing. Okay, now I wonder what else I skipped. Let's see. I think that's it. Anybody more things to say? Yeah. Is the night of I'm trying to remember to repeat the questions for the podcast. Is the night of faith and say it again. Okay, is the night of resignation an individual? Yes, but with qualifications that are important. When you see the woman in Hiroshima Mon Amour, you see that she's a complete individual. She's suspicious of ethics, and she's totally defined by her commitment. Being an individual doesn't mean being a knight of faith. Being an individual means having an unconditional commitment that gives you a definition. It's important to realize that there are ways of being knights of resignation, like Augustine and Dante, that turn the defining commitment away from being individual to some kind of universal God. And those knights of resignation are not individuals. But you can be a knight of resignation and be an individual, and that's what the movie is supposed to show. She is one. And what's the test? Well, the question is there some particular relation in your life that gives your life meaning and gives your world meaning and defines who you are? She's got that. Too much of it, in a certain way. Okay. Anything else? I have a feeling I didn't repeat your question after all. Then nobody's perfect. Okay. Let's go on. I'm now going to tell you another way, because it's important you'll come across it, that the Greeks had a way of dealing with something like the Abraham-Isaac story in a way that shows the importance of philosophy and mediation. And that's the Agamemnon story, the tragic hero story. If you don't keep in mind, Kierkegaard thinks, that contrasting the tragic hero and the knight of faith, you won't really fully understand the knight of faith. So what happens, real quick like, he runs through it fast, and I'll run through it even faster, that there is a situation in which Agamemnon goes out to fight the Trojan War, but he gets stranded on an island, and he can't go on, and the soldiers are revolting, and they're hungry, and people are sick, and the prophet says, unless you kill your daughter Iphigenia, you can't go on this mission to get back Helen and conquer Troy. I can't resist saying one brilliant thing that a colleague of mine who just died recently, Joe Tussman, who was a philosophy professor here, said about this. Nobody has ever, I think, tried to understand why the prophet told Agamemnon that he had to sacrifice his daughter if he was going to go to war. And Tussman says, what the prophet is saying is, if you're willing to send all these other young men and women, these young people, to war where they're going to get killed, you have to be willing to have one of your own children killed. It's like saying, Bush, if you aren't willing to send some child or grandchild of yours to the Iraq War, where they might well be killed, you have no right to be leading in this war. So that's what the prophet says. It's very smart on the part of Aeschylus. And Agamemnon sees that this is right, and he kills Iphigenia. And what do people think about this? Well, they think it's terrific. They all admire him as a hero. That's what's interesting about it. Because by the local standards of what's good, he has done what's good. He has sacrificed his love and his father job and his for a higher ethical. He suspended one ethical by another. His higher ethical was to do his duty as king. And it turned out that to do his duty as king, he had to make this sacrifice. And the amazingly good and impressive thing was, he was strong enough to do it. This is on 87. You read at the bottom, the difference between the tragic hero and Abraham is obvious enough. The tragic hero stays within the ethical. He lets an expression of the ethical have its telos in a higher expression of the ethical. He reduces the ethical relation of father and son or daughter and father to a sentiment, that is to a feeling, that has its dialectic, that is its higher thing, in relation to the ethical life. That may not be as illuminating as you like, so let me see if I can find another. At the middle of the page, Abraham's whole action stands in no relation to the universal. That's the opposite. It is purely private. While then the tragic hero is great through his deeds being an expression of the ethical, Abraham is great through an act of purely personal virtue, going against the ethical. So, let's see, is that enough to make this distinction clear? I think it should be, but let me see if I'm missing anything. It's important because we've been talking about mediation. It's important that Agamemnon can say what he did, and everybody can understand what he did. It's all completely intelligible, what I just said. We can all almost get inside of a culture. We just did. I mean, in our culture, if the president, if the commander-in-chief isn't ready to sacrifice his child, he has no right to sacrifice anybody's child. We can all say, yeah, that's right. And if he's brave enough to draft his child and send them off to Iraq, that's admirable. Okay, so where are we? We're on page 103. That's where he talks about what? Let's see. Where? At the bottom. The Knight of Faith knows it gives inspiration to surrender oneself to the universal, that it takes courage to do so. That is, the Knight of Faith even admires Agamemnon, but also that there is a certain security in it. Just because it is for the universal, he knows it is glorious to be understood by every noble mind. See, that's Agamemnon. And in such a way that even the beholder is ennobled. That's what the tragic hero does. Let's look at the middle of 105. The tragic hero is soon finished. His struggle is at an end. He makes the infinite movement and now safe in the universal. But the Knight of Faith, he can't do that. He's kept awake, for he is under constant trial and can turn back in repentance to the universal at any moment, and this will be a temptation. We'll talk about that more later. That would be too hard to do at this point. I'm saving it. Let's see now. Okay. At the top of 89, just to see the difference again. Abraham can't be mediated, which can also be put by saying he cannot speak. The moment I speak, I express the universal, that is, the shared intelligibility. And when I do not, no one can understand me. So the moment Abraham wants to express himself in the universal, he has to say that his situation is one of temptation. Sometimes the nearest way to understand that is, whenever Abraham tries to say to anybody what he's up to, all he can say is, I'm a murderer. To himself even. There's no other description in the shared language. Let's suppose they don't understand what sacrifice means, which Kierkegaard thinks nobody understands. And if God wrote in the sky, it's okay for Abraham to sacrifice Isaac because I really like that and I call that a sacrifice. And everybody gets a new vocabulary and they say, we see, that's good. Abraham is a hero. But it isn't like that. Nobody understands what sacrifice means, and Abraham's out trying to kill his son, and Abraham doesn't understand it either. Abraham just knows he has to do it. It's his calling, but he doesn't know why he's doing it. He can't say why he's doing it. I think that's why Kierkegaard thinks he can't explain to Regina or himself or anybody else why he has to break his engagement and leave her. But something higher is calling him to do it. That's the situation, very different from Agamemnon's. There are lots of places where you can find where Abraham, if he speaks, says he's a murderer, or would. Let's see, on top of 95. So Abraham's story contains a teleological suspension of the ethical. He has, as the single individual, never mind the single. Alistair, how can you do this? Okay. become higher than the universal. This is a paradox which cannot be mediated. How he got into it is inexplicable, and how he stayed in it. If this is how it is with Abraham, then he is not even a tragic hero, but a murderer. To one to go on calling him the father of the faith, to talk of those and so forth, is thoughtless. And then skipping a little, when a person sets out on the tragic hero's admittedly hard path, there are many who could lend him advice. It's out in the public domain. But he who walks the narrow path of faith, no one can advise him, no one understands. And you even, I see if I can flip to it, you think you're crazy if you're doing this sort of thing. You are sort of crazy. Here on the bottom of 85, again, so Abraham suspends the ethical in that last paragraph. I thought it was, that's not the one I want. I want to show you where he talks about being crazy. I think it's in number 2. Here we are, on 103. Just after where he says, have I read this? I think so. He knows it's beautiful to make a translation of himself into the universal. Didn't I read that earlier today? Or am I imagining? Did I? Good. Well, if you now go skipping down below that, he knows it's beautiful to be born as the particular good, with the universal as home, his friendly abodes, and so forth and so forth. He also knows, this is what we didn't read, that higher up there winds a lonely path, narrow and steep. He knows it is terrible to be born in solitude, outside the universal, to walk without meeting a single traveler. He knows very well where he is and how he is related to men. Humanly speaking, he is insane and cannot make himself understood by anyone. And yet insane is the mildest expression for him. And I remember, keep saying to yourself, what would it be for him to be insane? Well, it would be every time he tries to understand, he knows that what he's doing is the most important thing. It's part of his calling. And every time he tries to understand what he's doing, all he can say is, I'm a murderer. Now, what I want to do now, by the way, before I forget, I want you to read for next time a little bit more than I had in the assignment. Just before, I want to put it on the board now because I might forget. It's just 137 to 139. We're going to need that, very crucial, later. But right now, I want to do the following. For the rest of the time, and first, I want to see everybody happy? I think I can turn this into a more controversial thing. But go ahead.
Obviously, that Einstein and Abraham is any different. In the sense that, you're turning into the distinction that Agamemnon can go on and explain to the soldiers that, I'm doing this for you, prove to you that I'm committed. But, sometimes I could say that Abraham is committed to, he says to his family, hey, I'm committed to God, and this is my acceptance to God that I'm willing to give.
But they won't understand that. You cannot, they'll say, Sarah's going to say, you're going to kill your favorite son, you're going to kill the one whose defining commitment is going to make you the father of the faith. What is this God, and how do you know you got any message from God? If he could mediate it, that's what I meant by writing in skywriting. If God had said, I know what, I told Abraham to do it, it's a sacrifice, it's perfectly all right. But there isn't anything like that, and it doesn't, with Agamemnon, everybody knows that it's all right, it's the right thing to do. They certainly don't think that just because Abraham goes around saying, sacrifice, it's okay, sacrifice, and notice, according to Kierkegaard anyway, Abraham doesn't say anything. He never says anything to Isaac or Sarah because he knows that nobody will understand him. Because he knows he doesn't even understand what he's saying, so he's not going to be justifying what he's doing. But I'm good. Good you said that. Sorry I didn't repeat the question, but it was the iPod crowd is not, sorry about that. Anyway, okay. Now I want to give you a phenomenon so that this won't sound like psychological or theological science fiction or something to you. There's some real experience behind this idea that you are an exception and you're called to be an exception and it's the best thing you ever did, and yet it's totally wrong, and whenever you try to describe it, you can only condemn it. And there are probably other examples, but the perfect example of this is what it would be like to be a homosexual, to be gay in Copenhagen in 1850. Now, maybe Kierkegaard was gay. There is some interest in this, but lots of gossip, and he talked about the thorn in his flesh, which he couldn't, and which kept him from marrying Regina, and he tore pages out of his journal where he was describing it, and so forth. But it doesn't matter whether it was true or not. What I want to describe is the phenomenon. If you're in a culture in which the vocabulary of what's worthy and unworthy is such that gays are sick, depraved, perverse, queer, all kinds of bad things, and there's nothing good you could say about them. It's just a hopeless, bad way to be. So now let's imagine Kierkegaard is in love with somebody, call him John, and now Kierkegaard feels that loving John is the most important and best thing in his life, and he's called to do it. It's an absolute calling. And then he tries to describe to himself or say to himself what he's doing. And all he can say to himself is, I'm doing a disgusting, perverted, evil, wrong, lower immediate thing. And that's what it's like that's my equivalent of this fancy talk of Abraham not being able to say anything but that he's a murderer. I want to say that in 1850 Copenhagen, there was nothing somebody gay could say to themselves except I'm a pervert. And then, just to bring in another little piece of it, Kierkegaard talks about when you're suspending the ethical, you also have a temptation. We've got to have more words. There's temptation, and then there is something that we need a name for what's pulling you down or up. There is some kind of thing which I'm going to call it an attraction. We don't have any word for it in our ordinary language or in Kierkegaard. But now, when you've got an unconditional commitment, you've also got something like a temptation. What's the temptation for the night of faith? With my example, you ought to be able to figure it out. Without, it would be harder. What? No, John is not the temptation. John is the one he loves, and he knows that's absolutely right, and he knows that it's absolutely wrong. Yes. That's right. The temptation is the ethical. If you're gay, the temptation in Copenhagen is to be straight, to get married and have children and be intelligible to yourself and everybody else. So Kierkegaard has a name for this. He calls it a trial. When a trial is like the temptation. It's the attraction of the universal. And here, where the attraction of the universal is a good thing to get out of your lower immediacy, here the temptation is a bad thing. It's to betray your unconditional commitment in the name of the universal. And now, it helps to understand that. By the way, a lot of you probably have seen Brokeback Mountain by now. I haven't. Is it going to help understand the temptation of the ethical to the gay? Why? And how? Is that what you said? What do you all say?
We said let's watch it.
Oh, let's watch it. How many have seen it already? You see, it's too late to watch. How many thinks it belongs in this course? I mean, given what we're talking about. I mean, is there a conflict? I have to go see it, but there ought to be a conflict in it between knowing what you really care about as an individual and what makes your life meaningful and the ethical. And I gather it's a sad movie because the ethical wins out. Okay, well, I have to go see it. But you have the categories to think about it. Now, wait, but don't get ready to go. Every minute counts because I'm very worried that I'm not going to be able to cover everything I need before that I have to give up on Kierkegaard. So let me think. Yeah, I did what I had to do. Okay, that's it.